morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Tales from the Foxhole, Surviving an Emergency and the Lessons Learned. Assembled on the dais are some folks who have had the thing happen to them that we probably think about on every flight. And we have a number of different situations represented, but they've all experienced an emergency, and they all are here to tell us about it. I want to introduce the panel, and when I introduce each member of the panel, I'd like them to tell us briefly about what they were flying, what their level of experience is, and what their incident was without going into the details of the incident. So we'll start with, anybody here know who Dennis Haber is?
No, who is that?
Oh, there he is. Hi, Dennis. Dennis had an SR-22 engine failure in Florida, and we wanted him to introduce himself and talk a little bit about what his experience and lay out the what and where of what happened.
Well, right now we're just doing basic introductions. Make sure we get this concept right. I started flying about 46, 47 years ago. I started when I was in the Navy. It was either that or be a side gunner on a Huey, which didn't appeal to me at the time. Since then, I had owned a Cherokee 140 that I bought for $5,500, sold for $5,700, and was thrilled. I had a twin Apache, which is something like a Geronimo, but without all the gadgets on it, and not quite an Aztec. Laid off while I went to law school to the extent that couldn't afford it, and spent a lot of time flying gliders because that I could afford. And laid off for a while, and then got back in when I thought I was buying a glider, and because the plane I bought had big wings, it turned out to be an early model Cirrus, which in the end turned out to be a glider. But that's my core experience. The core of what happened to myself and Ed to my right was that what was the phrase that that Andy didn't want to use this morning? It didn't explode. It blossomed. It blossomed unexpectedly and without notice at 7,500 feet when there was nothing wrong and it was running at 70%, 68% power, and it was a beautiful day, and it just stopped.
Great, thank you. On the other side over here, we have Giuseppe Caltabiano.
You said my last name properly. Good job, Trip.
University is working.
I've been practicing. Giuseppe, I think, was getting ready for a commercial check, right? I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about what happened.
Yes, thank you, Trip. Experience-wise, I started at 16 thanks to an Italian Air Force scholarship, and I learned to fly gliders. And as Dennis said, being even poorer in Italy, glider was the only thing that could fly that I could afford. Grew up flying gliders. I did 2 European championships, but I wasn't in the circuit. I was more into the precision landing that attracted me. Landing precisely without an engine was a good challenge. Later on in America, I learned to fly with a fan in front of me. And at that point, I also had typed in the Eclipse. I owned 2 Cirruses, and then our company owned an Eclipse. But I never came around to earn my commercial, because with Cirrus, as you all know, you need a retractable gear to do your commercial. And once I had the Eclipse, it was hard to find an examiner that would be able to do the check right on the Eclipse. So I came down to renting a Cessna 177 Cardinal retractable gear, and I was doing 1 hour required by the examiner before the check ride. And in the last 10 minutes of that 1 hour, the engine decided to become quiet, and that happened at 1200 AGL. And I'm here. I had dark black hair. Now it's a bit grayer, but for the rest, we're fine.
I'm thinking after I've heard from the two of you already, I'm starting to think about getting a glider rating.
You should. You should.
Yeah. Next is Harry Skirm. Harry?
Hi, my name is Harry, and I was trained in the Navy. Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry, thanks. My name is Harry, and I was trained in the Navy to fly, and I flew in the Navy for 11 years, and then I left and worked for the airlines, and so I've been flying with the airlines, Northwest Delta, and been flying since 1977. My Cirrus is a G5 Cirrus, and that was my first GA airplane and into the GA world, and it's quite different from my previous experience. The accident aircraft, I think, was a G1 SR-22, and I was a passenger in that one. Thank you.
Thanks, Harry. All right, next up is the gentleman seated immediately to my left and a colleague of mine, Ed.
I'm Ed Waters, and I learned to fly in 1982. Privately, I actually won a sales contest in business, and been flying off and on since 1982, and all pretty much single engine. I too recently got a glider rating after my dentist gave me the introductory ride back in May. Something I always wanted to do, and I procrastinated, but there we go. But over the years, I did the commercial and flight instructor and CSIP, and personally, I fly a G2 Cirrus and instruct another aircraft, and I work for this guy, so it's been a great experience this year.
Thanks, Ed. And next up, we have Michael Samp.
Good morning. My name is Mike Samp. I have started flying when I was 17. I've got my commercial certificate. I'm an instrument-rated pilot. I owned a SR-22 G2 for 7 years, put about 700 hours on it. I now have a G3 Perspective, and I was the host of a C2A clinic in Colorado Springs. We ended up one safety pilot short, so I said, no problem, I'll fly with my friend here, and I was also a passenger with Harry.
And you were obviously sitting
I was in the back seat.
in the back seat. So
Yep.
we get the perspective of a backseat emergency. All right. Mahmood?
Good morning. My name is Mahmoud Atai. I started flying in 1977, graduated U.S. Air Force pilot training in 79. I've been flying on and off, and last year in October, my wife and I pulled the chute. That's the tease.
That's the tease. Just the tease.
All right.
My wife and I.
We would like to have Laura, Mahmoud's wife, with us. She is in the Partner in Command course, but she is a graduate of the Partner Command course, and I believe it was, in fact, your wife that deployed the parachute in your incident. So it's our first graduate that we're aware of that has actually pulled the chute. Want to proceed now that we've introduced everybody with the topics that we're going to cover. And when Dennis proposed this, we wanted to make sure that we stayed consistent with a message that we have been espousing in our flight training material. And so we kind of looked at how these things fit in, and the way that we're going to do that is approach it with respect to three things. One is critical decision making. We have a seminar called Critical Decision Making, and when Tony gets somebody to present one of those, we're talking about the plans we make before we go flying, the being prepared part of that. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And in fact, I think what we'll do is go through these one by one and go through the panel. Let's talk a little bit about, as you think about the plans and preparations that you made in each of your flights, and of all of your flights in your logbook, how do you think those preparations had an impact on the event the day you had the emergency? We'll start at the end with Michael.
Well, because we were on a formation flight, and Harry will talk about this, we had done an extensive briefing of this specific flight. But having about 1,100 hours in a Cirrus by that time, I had thought about CAPS deployment many times. Always wondered what it would be like. Didn't think I would be a passenger when it happened. But I was in the back seat of the airplane actually without a headset, partly because mine are panel-powered headsets, and so I was not privy to the conversation going on up in front. But I think the kind of advanced planning for me as a passenger, being a Cirrus pilot, once it was pretty easy to discern when things started going bad. The avionics in this airplane were identical to the first airplane I owned, so I had a bird's eye view from the back seat up between the seats, and could pretty well see what was going on. And I really didn't panic, I think, as a result of, I was almost relieved when I saw him reach up and grab the CAPS handle. And it wasn't really till I saw the ground coming in the windscreen that it took on a fear component. So I think just that kind of CDM thing, it was almost like, okay, yeah, and when I could feel the parachute deploying, I thought, okay, it's out. It's all good, the sudden deceleration, saw the blue sky, everything was going as I had anticipated, and I think that CDM piece really helped me as a passenger with that. But it caused me, I fly a lot of angel flights, and it's caused me to do a different pre-flight briefing with my passengers as a result of my own experience, because I knew what to expect, but someone else wouldn't. And not to scare them, but just to say, if we do have to use this, here's kind of what you can anticipate.
After we get through this round, I want to come back to that pre-flight briefing for your passengers. So, Harry?
I first went through C2A training, the formation stuff, as a student, just to get a refresher, and I had a really good briefing background from Spike, who made sure that we covered all these basics. So on our particular flight, I tried to emulate that, and we talked about who was in command and who was going to do whatever when the emergency happened. The airplane was a Avidyne G1. I didn't know that airplane. I'm not a CFI. All I was the formation safety pilot and to teach formation. I fly a G5 perspective. So the brief had been, this is your airplane, you're in charge, you handle the emergencies, I'll make recommendations. If we pull a handle, you pull the CAPS handle. The only time I'm going to intervene is if you're incapacitated in there. And that was our brief. And we ended up actually executing that brief in there, and the pilot, Al Matthews, pulled the handle. It's a little bit difficult in formation flying as the pilot in command because your whole world is the lead. You don't know what your airplane's doing. You don't even know where you are in relation to anything. So it's like having a blindfold on and then having an emergency, taking the blindfold off and say, go. You probably practice that in unusual attitudes. Now here it is with engine management. And ours was extremely subtle. The engine never stopped turning. It was just there was no power in the throttle. We heard a pinging or a knocking occasionally that did increase as we went on. And so it was very hard to try to figure out what was going on. I mean, the engine was pretty smooth, so it was not fuel, air, ignition, everything was just kind of turning. It's just you added more and you added more, and there was nothing there.
Okay, Dennis, and then Dennis, focusing on before the flight, the things that you would normally think about.
Depending on the flight, I have a premise that I've carried for 47 years, and I do so when I'm driving too. My airplane's always trying to kill me. That's not a negative, that's a positive. It gives me a sense of appreciation that I should never take it for granted, and I don't take it for granted. It's a different kind of it's trying to kill me than when I'm driving my car and I'm on I-95 and everybody else is trying to kill me. But it's still the same appreciation. Having led CDMs from way back, even before Tripp was doing them and Mason was doing them, I was always of a safety culture where I was conscious of what to do. So the concept of flaps and caps at 500 feet was a very easy touch here, touch there, fine, I'm cool. In terms of a briefing, Ed had called me the day before or something, and now I didn't know Ed, and I didn't even know he was a CSIP. And he was in Miami, and he says, tell me about Miami. I said, well, why don't you come along? We go to breakfast on Saturday morning. He didn't know me. We had never flown together. This was purely a friendly flight. So there was no real briefing. It was a beautiful day. The engine was performing great. Perfect environment. No need for a briefing, but an underpinning of a safety foundation that still required flaps and caps and basic standards.
I recall the briefing. It was about 10 or 20 minutes with all your group. It was just we were trying to decide where to go out blueberry pancakes. That was pretty much the briefing. And as Dennis says, you know, we're both experienced pilots. You know, as an instructor, I had never met Dennis. You know, it was Saturday morning. I had flown my wife to Miami the prior Wednesday for a conference. And I was getting a little bored in the hotel room, so I reached out to Dennis, because, you know, on Saturday morning we were kids, we were bored to watch cartoons, and who was the best cartoons on COPA? This guy right here. So it kind of led me to Dennis, and it was really it was a very interesting experience and a great learning experience. But you know, very quickly you could see, you know, Dennis was well prepared. You know, my wary eye was watching him do his pre-flight, and I felt very secure in our trip up to Sebring.
Now, Giuseppe, this was in preparation for a check ride and a check out in the airplane. So your approach to this might be slightly different.
It was different from usually what I do with the Cirrus we owned, and the Eclipse was a different flow in this case. And it started earlier than usual. So I started with borrowing the POH of that plane, checking the manual, and checking also the engine, the maintenance log books, where I found out that that plane had not been flown since the last maintenance that happened months prior. So I actually went to the shop and I call him the airplane doctor. He is my mechanic. He's followed us on the Cirrus and on the Eclipse. He's a great guy. And I said, Doctor, let's go check this plane, because I'm going to fly in 2 or 3 days, and I don't know what's going on. It looks pristine, but let's check it. So we went in, checked the records. Everything seemed okay. We actually took it out on the ramp and turned it on, ran it up, and checked. It was 20 minutes long, run up and checking the engine. Then took it back, opened the cowls, look inside. Everything seemed fine. And the pre-flight briefing was, again, very slow, going around a plane which I was not familiar with, but for all flying in 172s, with the instructor, who admittedly had less experience than me, but he was the instructor. And I asked him what he planned to do. He said, I don't need to do anything. I just sit next to you and take pictures. If you can fly over my house, we'll take pictures. Yeah, I mean, we know each other. And that was, in terms of weather, it was a CAVU day. And in terms of transponder, we didn't even turn the transponder on, which is something different that sometimes in emergencies you have to consider. And that was pretty much the plan.
Mahmoud?
Okay, as far as preparation, this was just the fun flight, Friday afternoon. Laura had gone through a partner in command just a month prior to the accident, and we just got on the plane, and I just checked the NOTAMs on 3 different airports that we were going to do touch and goes and stop and get back to our own airport. That was basically all the preparation. We just checked the NOTAMs, and that was it.
Okay, so I think we've set the stage of how you are approaching your individual flights. I'm going to walk through a couple of things, and then we're going to ask about the actual flight. One is, at some point in each of these flights, a command decision was called for. This is one of the key components of what we're talking about at COPA University. You have to make a decision. You have to stay in command. And that's separate and different from just staying in control. So we're going to talk about that command decision that you had to make. Then, in several of these cases, whether it's PIC, you had an instructor on board, a CSIP on board, 3 experienced Cirrus pilots. We have the concept of sharing command and crew resource management. And I'd like to introduce that as part of the discussion of both what you liked about what happened with what you were doing, what you could do differently, and how we could do better. But I'm going to save that till after we discuss the incident. And then a little bit, the whole point of this is the psychology of the emergency, and we're going to talk about that as well. Just real quickly, we all study. We all study. You've demonstrated by your discussions, you have some knowledge of the airplane, you explain. We all do that. Most of us attend training and we talk about CDM. And finally, what we try to do in this dangerous hobby is move our risk, which we know is up there in the red, and drive it to the yellow. But when we talk about risk management, we talk about the likelihood of an event and the seriousness of the consequences in a matrix. And I want to talk a little bit about that as it relates to, we have airplanes with parachutes, right? Let's have that discussion today on this panel about the severity of the possibility of the risk being realized versus the likelihood once you've made a command decision. So we want to talk about that. We talk about things that we practice in our CPPs. We work on practicing the various emergency scenarios. So I want you to address how the practice either helped or didn't help, what we need to change about our practice. We had the partners who in some cases were of great assistance. And then we want to talk about, and these are all I'm showing you, CPPP or COPA University courses. We all have, we do have courses to cover this content, and this panel will help us in terms of modifying and changing that. We intend to get something from that. But at the end of the day, you were flying, and Dennis and I were talking about this. It was his idea for the panel. And we said, everybody thinks they have a plan. And this is a quote from the great philosopher and aviation safety expert, Mike Tyson. He says, everybody thinks they have a plan until they get punched in the face. And I think that's kind of what happened here. Everybody had a plan, and everybody on this panel got punched in the face. And so what I want to talk about now, and I'd like you to talk about, is the moment of realization that we have a problem, and if there's that moment of disbelief and how long that lasts, and what is going through your brain and what your actions are in the immediate moments you realize there's a problem. And I'm going to mix it up a little bit. I'm going to start with Dennis in this case.
There's a new movie coming out, Sullenberger, Miracle on the Hudson, which everybody, I guess, is familiar with. But it came to mind, or comes to mind now in retrospect. The trailer for the commercial says, I've been flying for 40-some years, but the only thing I'll be known for is the 218 seconds when I had to ditch. And that kind of occurs to me in retrospect, that the only thing I might ever be known for in my own fearful mind in retrospect is that number of seconds before we had to deal with the inevitable reality of what now. But then it occurred to me I'm probably better known for introducing Lobster Girl to COPA. But seriously, the operative thing for me was that moment of reality. If you have any illusion, because we debate this all on the forum, that you think you know what you're going to do. Oh, at that point I'd pull the chute at 600 feet, but not at 700 feet or not at 400. You don't know what you're talking about. Nothing personal, but you really don't know. Because the only thing that occurred to me at that moment is I had a devil here and an angel here, just like you see in the cartoons. And the angel said, "This isn't really happening. It's not. This is an experiment, a test." My CSIP did something to me, even though we were in instruction mode. And then the angel said, the devil said, "Hey, buddy, deal with it. It's happening."
So Ed, did you see the angels?
And we dealt with it, you know, and we talked. Give it back to you.
Ed, what, you're there while the angels are on Dennis's shoulder. What's going on in your mind?
You know, I had once I learned I was volunteered for this panel, I had Roger send me the data from the flight, you know, and we always see on COPA post your engine data. And it was fascinating because I got to look at the data of the flight, and I wasn't looking at anything to do with the engines. It was pretty much the timing of all the events. This played out over 8 minutes and 36 seconds from the time the case got fractured until the time we touched down. And looking at the data, we had 1 minute of head scratching, trying to figure out what to do, because after 1 minute, I got the nearest airport in, and then 20 seconds later, he called Mayday. And this is all in these engine files in the perspective system. You can see when the frequencies were changed, you can see when the navigation was done, you can see when the prop stopped. So I think there's, you know, I read about the lizard brain. I don't know that there's a lizard brain. I would just say it's like your computer when you have a bunch of apps open. You know, we can't multitask, but we just go from one task to the next. So I never had any fear or anything like that during a flight. I always felt like I was flying the airplane because the airplane was doing everything I wanted to do. Dennis was, for that first minute, everything was textbook with the flow. And then it was just a matter of realizing, you know, he announced, he goes, I think we blew a cylinder. And I was kind of optimistic. I said, well, we got 5 more of those. You know, we should be able to get somewhere. Looking out the window, it didn't go. But I did learn that we did share. There's 3 stages of denial of engine failure, and the first stage is something really bad happened to the engine, but it's okay because the prop is still turning. And the second stage is something bad happened to the engine, and now there's oil on the windscreen. But it's okay because the prop is still turning. And the third and final stage, and you're going to remember this well, I've never told you this, but the third and final stage is when you stop everything you're doing and you stare at these black objects in front of you, which are your propeller blades. And we both stopped there for about 10 seconds and just stared because it's something we never saw before. I think you remember that, right?
Yeah, props don't stop. They just don't unless you're in a stall.
Yeah. So it was an emergency that just built up over time. You know, I was like, well, we might get some.
So the question I'd like you to sort of delve just a little deeper into is that period where you could not do anything and you weren't making any progress towards a solution, and you're still accepting the reality. Would that say, I'm hearing somewhere between 1 minute and 20 seconds? Could you quantify that, or can you look back and find any?
It's just a matter of a little bit of disbelief. I think Dennis thought he did something wrong at first. I think he was like, what did I do wrong?
Well, that's kind of an instinctive thing.
Yeah.
It can't be the airplane. It's got to be something I did wrong.
But, you know, I think the successful outcome was just because we had, you know, I mean, there's a reason we have 2 pilots and jets.
Hey, we got to keep the suspense up. We don't know that you've succeeded.
Okay. But,
I know you're here, but
yeah.
we're going to find out about that in a
I
minute.
think for us, the first reaction is life is simple in the sense that just best glide speed, then figure everything else out. Don't start switching switches and engines, and there's time for that. Best glide speed, 7,500, just best glide speed. That's all I had to know.
Your event was the only one at altitude, right? Nobody here was 75?
Yeah, we just had
7,500 feet?
So
Okay.
best glide speed, okay, what's next? Now we'll start fiddling with knobs and point it in the direction. We couldn't find the nearest button. Just point it in the direction of something on the MFD, because that was the limits of our thinking. Both of us spooked out on something totally bizarre where everybody, so this is my 3rd Cirrus. You push the button on the comm, it goes to 121.5, right? I couldn't figure that out. I had to dial in 121.5. You did the same thing with the transfer?
Yeah, I did. I put in 7,700. When you called Mayday, I put in 7,700 on perspective, and I was very deliberate doing it. And then about a minute later, the air traffic control was asking us to squawk 7,700. So I couldn't quite figure that out. I did call Garmin, and what they told me was because I was putting that in from the FMS, you were doing something on a PFD, and it won't allow the transfer. But I'd never, like I say, I put it in, but I never looked over to verify it. So that's why we had to do the 7,700 a little bit later. But.
So the things you think you know and that should happen don't always happen the way you think they should happen. don't suppose that they do.
And the other thing too, I get some questions at the COPA is I was asked, well, did you set up the autopilot for the best glide? Did you use your flight path marker to figure out where you're going to go? And I just kind of laughed because that all sounds great, you know, reading COPA, having coffee in the morning. But when these perspective planes break, it's kind of unnerving because what we had for, yeah, he doesn't remember this, but the most annoying thing for me in the whole flight was the CAS system beeping, and it was a low pressure warning. And I don't know when it stops. Does it stop when the engine completely dies? Yeah, well, we never did. Yeah, we had some sound effects, and that was probably the most unnerving thing. It was just a constant reminder.
I didn't hear a thing.
Yeah, he didn't hear a thing.
So backing up, before we solve the problem here
Okay.
that you ultimately did solve, there was some delay in
Yes.
recognizing this can't be happening or this has happened. And I'm getting, at altitude, this turns out to be somewhere you think between a minute and 20 seconds.
It was 1 minute.
All right, now, Giuseppe, you're not at altitude,
No, I
right?
didn't have time.
Yeah, so
And,
where did your,
What happened was we had flown 50 minutes around our valley, which is beautiful, and I am paranoid. I tell my wife, don't look inside my brain when we fly because you're gonna get scared. So because I picture rapid decompression on the eclipse, I picture fires and stuff. So I was flying the plane, looking at highways. I just did some seaplane flying, so I was aware of where I was all the time. And then we landed, and I relaxed, and I realized I needed 10 more minutes. So we took off again, and I was much more relaxed. I was leaving the airport towards the VOR, 1,200 feet AGL, and it got quiet. And I realized, and I do not know why, but I realized my hands were doing things, and I was watching. My hands turned, pushed the yoke. It was a Cessna, so it has a yoke. Pushed the yoke down a little bit and turned towards the airport. And this hand here was switching the fuel, which I hadn't done in a Cessna for ages. But all of a sudden, I'm watching my hand turning, first pushing the throttle, and then moving the fuel switch. Never occurred to me to look at a checklist. There was no time anyhow. And then I clicked and I called the emergency. Then my brain said, this engine stopped. And that was my delay. So my hands were faster than me realizing what was going on. So it was also almost muscle memory. On the other side, Jason, with whom we fly a lot together, was taking pictures. Now, seriously, he was taking pictures. Now, we were wearing the headsets we wear on the Eclipse that are on a Cessna makes it very noisy. So the engine quits and gets very quiet. And he's still taking pictures. So I actually called the emergency. I nudged him and I said, the engine quit. I'm serious. This is talking about denial. So he looks at me and looks out. He goes, what do you mean the engine quit? I say, Jason, the blade, like you're saying, do you see this blade stopped? I said, the engine quit. Now he's an instructor. We've flown together a lot. He grabs the throttle and shoves it in again and goes like this. And I'm flying the plane. And that was the last thing I'm going to say on this stage. He grabbed the yoke. He literally grabbed the yoke. And I saw myself doing this. My plane. He said, sorry. And that was the time. And it was probably no more than 10 seconds.
okay. Mahmoud?
Yeah, to explain like you mentioned, command decision and
Before we get to the command decision, you had to realize there was a problem.
right.
So,
I have to explain what happened.
Sure.
To come to that point. Late afternoon in October, clear weather and everything. We went and did touch and go in the nearby airport, then stopped in another airport and came back to our home airport. Any occasion, any chance I get, at least once every 2 weeks, I go fly and practice emergencies. Engine out, no flaps, things like that. So we did 2 engine outs, everything worked out, and landed the plane, touch and go. And the last thing was to do a no flap. And as I was flying on downwind, this Cessna 150 called 2 miles final. So I realized at one moment I thought, well, maybe I should scrap this, just make it a normal landing. Then I thought, well, emergencies don't happen bright daylight and with everything going perfect. So I said, well, I just imagine I have problem with my flaps and just need to do a no-flap landing. On the radio announced, you go ahead and land, then I'll be number 2 behind you. So the fact that they are too slow and I was kind of faster than normal, I let them pass a beam and went a little bit farther. So basically I went farther than normal no flap turn to base. I turned a level turn to base and then level turn to final. I really just tried to keep the distance between us, and needless to say, I mean, I need to say this, that the PAPI lights weren't working. And we were coming, and I was trying to keep the distance between my plane going 90 knots and the 150 probably going 60, 65, and make sure there is enough distance. So I think I was kind of fixated on the other plane and making sure keep the distance. And all of a sudden, airplane went to nose down. Looked like a 90-degree nose down. With the landing gear, the landing lights on, all I could see was ground. For a moment, I mean, after 38 years of flying, all I knew was maintain aircraft control. I mean, analyze situation and take proper action, land as soon as conditions permit. But basically what happened, maintain aircraft control, go for it. I mean, I didn't even finish maintain aircraft control. Nothing is happening. Went for the shoot, and it wasn't there. It wasn't there. I mean, I really panicked. It wasn't there. And we were going between the power lines. So the airplane going between the power lines, and we were just being thrown away, I mean, to the left and right. And it took a lot of effort to look to see what's going on. And Laura, my wife, had pulled the chute. And I went, I put my hand over her hand, thinking maybe she didn't pull it hard enough. She had pulled it hard enough. It was all the way. And so what happened, the parachute deployed and the canopy deployed fully above the power lines. And we got, the nose of the plane was probably 2 to 3 feet to the ground. We never hit the ground. And I opened the door, and one of the power lines hit the ground, and it started grass fire. And we both said, let's get out. And I opened the door. She said, I can open my door. So I said, come my way. I jumped, and she jumped to me, and we called 911. And the decision that I had to make was first maintain aircraft control, but really for a moment that I tried and it didn't work, and I went for the shoot. She made the decision, and I think the cockpit resource, she was one of my resources. I mean, that's why I take her anywhere I go now.
Very good. So, very good. I think you answer concisely. Does the delay have any impact on the outcome? In your case, a well-trained PIC, it wasn't any delay. You had excellent training and was ready to act when the time came.
But she acted faster. Yes.
Okay. Harry?
For me, I probably have the most training of anybody just from my military background, my airline background, all the training, the CRM, ejection seat training, and some of it came into play and some of it didn't. I think COPA membership has labeled it lizard brain along the way. Best example I can give is you just lost your engine, name the 9 steps for your procedure. How many got past 3 along the way? It's that kind of thing. And for us, it was that kind of timing. We were probably only 2,500 feet AGL. We did not know exactly where we were, so it was get your eyes separate from the lead airplane and then start trying to figure things out. By the time we had an idea of what was going on, we didn't have much time. Command and control, we had a little bit of communication problem between the pilot and myself when we realized, okay, we've got an engine issue. Well, let me back up a second. Al said, my oil pressure looks low, and it's down at about 35 PSI. It's looking in the green. I said, what's normal? And he goes, I don't know, because he only had 20 hours in the airplane at that time. So, and I have to admit, I didn't know I couldn't recall what exactly normal is at that point in the experience also. So then when we heard the knock, we said, okay, we're going back. And we made the turn and broke off and got our eyes going in the right direction. And I recommended that he set the power at an intermediate setting. Let's go back to Colorado Springs. And then I noticed that Al was looking at divert fields, and then we were already on approach control, and they were giving us fields along the way, and we realized that it's going to be difficult to make. And then I happened to look over, and I saw his altitude at 7,000, so that was about 1,000 feet AGL. I said, watch your altitude, and he said, throttle's full forward. And that took the decision away. But he didn't communicate that, hey, Harry, the power's, we're not getting anything. We're, the engine's not producing power for us. So we had that communication error. Had we had a little bit more, the command or the decision-making would have been easier. But like I alluded to earlier, it was very subtle. As soon as he said the power is full forward, then I knew immediately and immediately called Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. We're pulling the handle, and turned to Al and said, pull caps. And Al, I noticed, was looking around because his background, he's a CFI, and he's been teaching in Cessnas and stuff, and he was looking for a place to land. His mind was a different mindset because he just had not had that intensive COPA, even though he trained with a CSIP, pull caps right away. It wasn't the first thing on his mind. So he looked at me and said, what? I said, pull caps now. And then he pulled it, and that was that. We had 13 seconds from the time that the handle was pulled to the time of our landing, and we were very lucky. The chase airplane had a professional photographer in the back who probably has 380 pictures from the time of the caps pulled to the ground, and I'm just amazed that somebody has a data card that big, to hold all those pictures. And a lot of them are on the site. But as far as the command decision to go, sometimes it's obvious and it's easy, and sometimes it takes a little bit to get there.
So let me follow up with you on that just a moment. There was a delay. You speak of a delay because of a communications error, maybe previous training with looking for a field versus caps. The question that's up on the screen right now is, did the delay have any impact on the outcome? Do you think that made a difference would the outcome been any different if you could have communicated more clearly or effectively at that moment?
The short answer is yes. If anybody's seen the picture, we came down at about 80 degrees nose-low attitude, and that's how we impacted off of that. The rear risers had not fully stretched and released. We hadn't got that last bit where the airplane could land on the gear. If we had maybe one more second, we think the chute, as the pictures, we have this where the chute's opening, and it wasn't until like 1 second you could see the shadow of the airplane on the ground before we got a full chute. And had we had another second, possibly 2, I think the risers may have released. We don't know, how it all worked mechanically, and we may have landed in the attitude and had a better result out of it. So yes.
Okay. So, Michael, the interesting thing here is we kind of have, Dennis is a lawyer here, but kind of a court case, right? You have no headset, so you can't talk to them. You're in the back seat, you can't affect the outcome. But you could be the judge of what was going on. Can you corroborate how this played out?
Thanks, Dennis. I appreciate that.
I might need one too.
First of all, I want to say being 1,100 hour Cirrus pilot in the back seat when things go bad is the most helpless I ever want to feel. Not that I would second guess Al for a minute. He did the best he could under a very difficult set of circumstances. You know, one bad on my part, talking about CRM, I did actually look up, because it's my habit as a pilot, as soon as I put power in for takeoff, I'm looking for oil pressure and airspeed, and I couldn't break that habit even from the back seat. I did notice the oil pressure light was on as we were on takeoff roll, and largely because I didn't have a headset, you know, by the time I was thinking about saying something, I looked back up again and it had gone off. And under CRM, anybody in the plane that sees something that doesn't look right should, you know, say something, and I didn't. Would that have changed the outcome? Probably. You know, if he would have just said, we can't go, we're going back and check this out, I don't know what we would have found. The other thing I need to say first is the investigation's still ongoing, but we all knew that airplane had had major engine work done the week before. And you know, maybe we all should have been a little more attentive. But, you know, Harry, I give him credit, because the one thing I did hear without a headset was Harry going, pull it! and that, you know, that extra second or two that he talked about would have been significant, but it probably would have been a few more seconds had Harry not, you know, shouted out when he did.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that NTSB investigator Deborah Hersman says, I think it's her quote, is that Part 91 operators operate an airline of one. And we're doing everything. And in this particular case, every time there was somebody else on board with some sort of qualification to help, whether having taken a PIC course, another instructor, another pilot, there was somebody there where you had crew. And so we have this discussion we can have. The next question, oddly enough, I think everybody's almost answered it. What role did the pilot not flying or the person not flying play? I think Mahmoud wins the gold star for that answer. So it leads me to the dynamic duo of Dennis and Ed, who were it's not a caps pull. We're at altitude. There's two people in the cockpit that are now forced to work into a situation. What role do you think, and I guess I want to ask the question of Dennis, what role do you think Ed played in the successful outcome of your event? Or did he play? Don't hurt his feelings. I work with him every day.
That's a tough question in some sense, because before that day I didn't know Ed or what he was capable of. But I can tell you what role he did in fact play, and that was mostly a calming effect. I immediately set it into best glide and pointed in the right direction, and he didn't say much. What amazed me most is, since he also didn't know me, that he didn't grab the controls just out of instinct. I might have done just that were I in the right seat, but he didn't. He just had a calming voice that said, watch your airspeed, watch your altitude. We discussed briefly the simplicity in some sense of an engine failure at that altitude. And the simplicity is, we don't even have to think about pulling caps right now. What we had to think about is the options available to us, which in that case, we discussed, and Ed brought this up. Life is simple. 1,500 feet or caps at 1,500 feet. But at that stage, it gave us the mental freedom, and to the extent that we discussed it, he gave me the mental freedom to be cognizant of, okay, fly the plane. Just fly the plane, point it in the right direction. At very least, let's get it to a place where we had to use the chute, it was at least a clear spot. Keep in mind, we were over the Everglades. And while I get professional courtesy with alligators, Ed doesn't. So it was a calming effect and a discussion that occurred that allowed for a simplicity in focus, if that makes sense.
In the risk management piece in preparing for this, one of the things I was looking for was a statistic of number of pilots eaten by alligators after forced landings. And it seems to be remarkably hard to find. So
Well, that's because I'm on the board of directors, and I've had discussions with the alligators, at least in my term.
I can see, as usual, you've been effective. Ed, I'm going to preface this comment and set you up for this by the fact that we're both flight instructors and do a lot of flight instruction in Cirrus. And one of the things I know that is the role of somebody else in the airplane is subtle in that you could be over there in the right seat going, they need to do this, they need to do, and you feel like you're trying to will somebody to do something. But sometimes just a small, subtle behavior or gesture actually makes that happen. Just a subtle, I'm looking at this and somebody sees your eye it's out of the corner of their eye, what you're looking at. Do you think, I'm giving you the freedom to disagree with this, do you think what you looked at or anything that you did changed anything he would have done?
I don't think so. I think, just being, the nice thing is, if you're going to have an emergency, it's nice to have somebody there to share it with. That's pretty much it.
What a gift.
But, as an instructor, the hardest thing about being an instructor is, you really have to keep your hands to yourself, because if you start doing things as an instructor, the student doesn't learn. And so, again, I was watching all this play out, and the reason I never took control of the airplane, because I felt like I was flying the airplane. Everything I thought should be happening was happening.
Okay, good. That leads me to the last question and the important question. I think this has been a great discussion. You can see everything from a partner with great training immediately taking action and now being the crew member, to folks that are incapable of being a crew member because they're in the back seat without a headset. It's a wide spread. But what I'd like to do, and I think I've certainly got things from listening today on things that will affect the way I teach, is are there any behavior changes that you see we need to make in talking to ourselves as a group of Cirrus pilots that will make a difference when they take their turn getting punched in the face? I'll start with Michael and we'll come this way.
I guess a couple things. One is I've become I have a great appreciation for above ground altitude. I fly routinely in Colorado with high elevations, high density altitudes, and and I now have my own hard deck for the cabs. That beyond that, I won't think anymore. I won't hesitate because I now know what's not high enough, almost, and I won't do that again. As I mentioned before, I think doing a more thorough pre-flight briefing for my passengers. I now actually, between that and going through a training at the United Airlines Training Center in Denver, I actually now have my passengers open the right-hand door. Because just to tell them to pull up on this lever, it's kind of like reaching for it and it's not there. Harry had to open the door. It was an airplane he was unfamiliar with. He did get it open, but it was actually behind him. And so I do that. The other thing is I used to kind of quickly say if something happens to me, pull the throttle and mixture off, reach up, pull this cover, pull the handle. That was about it. But I now tell them, and after you pull the handle, here's what you can expect to happen. Because, I now know what that's like. And as a passenger, I think that's important for them to know.
Harry?
Well, for me, I had to go back and go through emergency procedures and try to kind of just keep things fresh in my mind. Briefing the passengers is what to expect, just as Mike says I've done. When I fly, I try to keep a nearest airport up, so I've got to keep the DME down and I'm constantly figuring out what my glide range is, and can I make that airport? Can I make this airport as I'm flying my cross-country? I would like to talk to a Garmin rep somewhere, if anybody's around, to see if one of the outputs on my MFD can be an AGL altitude, so I know what I'm at and not have to do the math flying over mountainous terrain, because I'm in the Puget Sound and I have to cross the mountains a lot. So to have an output where I can just sit there and see AGL, because if you're doing lizard blade and everything else and then trying to compute, because the only thing I can do with the perspective is to push the button where I'm at, then see an altitude of the terrain, and then do the math in there. So I think that's a little cumbersome off of that. And if you've got a low cloud deck, then it's kind of hard to see and judge from that. So it's just my preparation and going through and anticipating that I may need to pull the handle.
Very good. I didn't intend to give any instruction here today, but since we got a lot of prospective pilots here, and you mentioned it, the TAWS page tells you whether you're over 1,000 feet. It's not going to give you a number, but it tells you whether you're more than 1,000 feet above where you are right now. So there is,
Great idea.
there's something there.
Thank you, sir.
That, Dennis,
I had to think about that one as you were asking.
you want us to come back to you?
No,
Okay.
it's fine. At least in the area I fly, I regularly am told to fly under the B because in Miami, and I'm on the south side of Miami, so ATC, for their own reasons, doesn't like you to get in the way of their approaching traffic into Miami. So they will traditionally force the single-engine aircraft to fly under 2,000 feet, which I've always viewed as a dangerous place to be. And the guys I fly with to the pancake breakfast regularly, I fly straight west, go up to 7,500 feet, so I'm over the B, and I get made fun of all the time. I'm not going to change on that one. Altitude is my friend. Gas in the tank on the ground is not good for me if I need it. But I think mostly what it reinforced was a concept that I kind of knew but didn't think about much, is that keep your life as simple as possible, especially on an altitude, engine failure at altitude. Your only two things you really need to think about is that I've got caps if I need it, consider caps, and 1,500 feet in my case was my hard floor, knowing that I still had arguably 1,000 feet worth of cush area if for whatever the reason I couldn't decide at that moment. I still had a calm at 1,500 feet. So 1,500, consider caps, 1,500 feet your alternative, keep it simple, then deal with the rest of it.
Ed?
Yeah, to Dennis's point, we did find the runway with, it was 1,600 feet was our altitude when we found the runway, so you're correct in your thinking. I did learn that there's a bit of a false sense of security thinking you can call Mayday, you know, out of the blue, and somebody's going to help you. By the time they helped us, of course, we had Fort Myers, and we had Miami, and by the time they identified us and we told them what we're doing, it was old news. We'd already got it figured out. So it was a little bit of a false sense of security, you know, squawking 1,200 doing that. The other thing I do religiously is I always display my nearest page. So personally, I fly Avidyne, and on the bottom 430, I have the traffic page, but I spin it over and I leave it on the nearest page. There's a problem with the perspective system. You can, if whoever flies perspective, you can display your nearest airport. You do that with good intention, and as soon as you get an advisory, you acknowledge the advisory, and then your nearest goes away. So I did talk to Cirrus and I did talk to Garmin, and they're having some discussions, and I think on a future update, it's going to default back to whatever you're running, whether you're running nearest or running your flight plan. So, but you really want to know your nearest airport at all times, because when you need your nearest airport, the reason's going to be really stressful. And you don't want to make it simple on yourself. You really need to know, and you can, you don't have to do the direct to and all that stuff. It's going to tell you exactly where to go and how far it is. But yeah, so that's probably the biggest outcome for me in my teaching with that.
Before we go further, I need to get over here a second. I wanted to ask one other thing then. you're talking about a procedure. With respect to things that seem to have worked, when our organization started talking about caps, and we started talking about introducing the idea of caps as active on takeoff and climbing, and became something that most of us mention or talk about at the beginning of every flight. It's now something it's going to be at the front of our mind. Recently in the CPPP, we've started talking about the level, if you have the level button or the blue button, and using that when you're out of command as a way of restoring command and getting the airplane to quit going somewhere you don't want it to go. Are you suggesting maybe a third mantra would be practice, not just keep it up, but practice doing, having going to a nearest airport from time to time?
Yeah, absolutely. And you'll be surprised, you know, there's in teaching a Cirrus, there's different quirks. And, you know, if you get into an airplane that has a composite prop, it sinks like a rock. It's you know, totally different outcome. So you have to, that's a great training aid. And I just finished transition training on a guy coming out of a 172, and he's in a G3 with a composite prop, NA. And we did just that. And of course we came up short, and I just let him come up short because that's the realization he needed, that he's not flying a 172 anymore. So, absolutely.
I've often found it a valuable exercise for exactly that reason.
Yeah.
You find out it's not easy. Giuseppe.
Well, again, my case, I had very little time. Normally, when I fly, I tell myself, take a breath, because nothing is going to happen during the time you take a breath. We normally fly high, and there is time to think. I realized that there was no time to think, so things needed to happen automatically. And the only people I have some authority on are my kids. So what I did, I sent them both to glider training, and my daughter is a private pilot, and I had her, she doesn't have the full rating, but she's flown gliders now, and my son is on his way too. So I was thankful to my automatic glider training that made my hands and feet do the right thing before my brain could catch up. So my invitation to everybody here, and I keep writing it also on the forum, is go fly gliders, because that will teach you a lot. The nearest to is ingrained in your brain. You picture funnels in the sky, and from each funnel you can get into an airport safely, and you hop from a funnel to another, so you're always safe. The other thing I thought is, which is hard, is if you change type of aircraft, things are different. I do not know if I never looked at the ceiling was because I knew I was in a Cessna, or because I had completely forgotten, having flown the Eclipse for years, that I did not have the cap handle. But I second-guessed myself later. I thought, had it been a Cirrus, would I have thought about pulling that handle? So I reinforced the point of practicing. One thing is the theory, but the practice and the muscle memory, I think it's the most important thing.
I mean, what behavior changes do you think, and what things would contribute to safe outcomes when people are faced with situations such as yourself?
As they mentioned, practice, and really, in my case, I didn't even think. I mean, it wasn't like, okay, now I'm going to go for the shoot. No, it just happened, and I went for it. So, thinking that it's there and having it in your mind that if something goes wrong, I'm going to go for it, and be ready for it, basically.
What about the role of partners?
Well, obviously, I have to mention that the partner in command was extremely helpful in our case, and she had just had taken the class a month prior to the accident, and she had her checklist, and that was basically the only thing that survived that was hers, because everything else in her purse just destroyed.
Well, and that is why in the class they say,
Right.
wear it because...
Because, I mean, that was the only thing that survived with her, and she really Now, it actually, even before that, after the class, it became her job, basically. She took it upon herself to make sure the pin is out, I mean, the cover is off, then the pin is out. And she always says, we have seen few pictures of COPA members, and that they had taken pictures, and the cover is still on. There is no time to take the cover off, pull the pin out, and pull the handle. Make sure that thing is, that pin is out. That's something I had to mention.
Okay, so we have about 10 minutes. I've got a note here for final thoughts. First, before we go anywhere else, anybody on this panel say there's something else that needs to be said, please jump in and do that. And what the remaining 10 minutes, we'll take a question or two. Anybody on the panel?
I'm just thankful. I think I wasn't fully in control, so either the circumstances or whatever your faith is, I'm thankful that it came up to be this way.
And we all are. Anybody with the questions, come to the mic. Let's go to the microphone so everybody can hear the questions. And we'll take one or two, maybe three questions.
I'm wondering if the airbags went off on any of the pulls.
We had no airbags.
Don't you have on the...
Our airplane did not have airbags. He wanted to know if the airbags went off on any of the caps pulls.
We didn't have airbags.
And we didn't have an accident, so.
No, we didn't have airbags.
Okay, anybody else?
Does anybody know what activates the airbag?
So in this case,
So like on your impact, it should have...
And ours, the airbags would have gone off had we had airbags installed.
Yeah.
Tom?
And you, did you have airbags?
We didn't have the airbags.
You didn't have airbags.
Tom?
I'm trying to visualize exactly what happened during your flight. I must have missed something. I know you were doing a no-flap landing. You were going 90 knots. I'm not sure what your altitude was, but
Low.
why did your wife pull the chute? And did you not? It seemed like it would have been a loud explosion when the rocket went through. And I got a little confused. I must have missed something. Why the chute had to be pulled in the first place, and why you didn't recognize that when you went up there it wasn't there. So I got
Okay.
confused.
Just imagine you're flying and all of a sudden you have a
At night.
90 at night.
Did it stall? Or
No, we hit the power lines. We hit the top line.
altitude, I guess?
Low. I don't know. I mean, I was low, obviously.
All right, let's
So-
take one more question. Thomas?
Hello, does this work now?
The switch may be off.
I'm gonna yell.
That'll work.
Thanks. I mean, that's really good information, and I've had a partial engine out as well. And one of the things I learned, the result of the training I had recently was I did have the presence of mind, just because I benefited from training the week before from picking up a new airplane, was that a takeoff briefing is very important in terms of what the cap's altitude is. So taking off out of Lakeland, I had a partial engine out. I knew I had to be at 800 feet before I could execute the CAPS maneuver. And because I'd had recent training, I knew that. But if I hadn't had the benefit of that, my reptilian brain would have been like, okay, what the hell am I going to do? Because after that incident, I realized that I can't tell the difference between 400 feet and 800 feet from looking outside. You know, no one knows what it is. So it's always good to always do that. And that's something I constantly do. And I want to thank you guys for your contribution. It's always good to hear about other people's experiences, because it's always a learning, especially when you walk away from it. Thanks.
I think that's one of the healthy behaviors. Thank you. We appreciate that. We appreciate you attending, and I wanted us to express our appreciation for the folks who came up and took the time to share with us what it's like living in the Foxhole. Thanks a lot.